So we're here with Konstanty Gebel, the head of the Warsaw office of the European Council on Foreign Relations, a former journalist, a colleague.
Well, a current journalist still. Please, I still have a column.
Yeah, you do. Well, a journalist is always a journalist, actually, who was a correspondent in the Western Balkans for quite a lot of time. So he obviously knows our region very well, and there is a very important summit coming up for the Western Balkans. A lot of countries wait for some very important decisions to be taken at the European Council on December 9th, and this is what we're going to talk with Mr. Gebel right now. So, you've been to the Western Balkans in many countries in the region for a long time, during the war too. How do you find the region right now?
Well, it's almost as to have you wonder if there still is a region. The countries are moving at different speeds in different directions. I returned from Pristina 2 weeks ago, and Pristina was unexpectedly and strikingly optimistic in terms of activity, of dynamism. And if you travel from Pristina to Sarajevo, you can see just how badly things can go. Sarajevo is still a depressed city. Sarajevo is still a city that lost the war. So the Western Balkans are traveling in different directions. And obviously, from the perspective from over here, the European summit will be about the Western Balkans. Except that in Brussels, nobody knows that. The European summit will be about the future of the euro. The Western Balkans are an afterthought.
Yeah.
They're an item on the agenda. And this is characteristic, I think, of the very disparate visions of the Western Balkans, depending on where from you look at them.
Do you think that from this perspective, because since you've mentioned the crisis and this is an issue we cannot avoid not talking about, this could in some way overshadow and change the perspective the EU leaders have on the Balkans?
Well, it already has. The Western Balkans, as I said, are an afterthought. And in a way, if they matter at all right now, they matter within the context of the crisis. That is, one argument for continuing involvement with the Western Balkans is the reflection that, well, if people still want to join, maybe we're not in as big a mess as we think we are, right?
Right.
But basically, the discussion will be about the crisis, as it rightly should. And also, we have to realize that enlargement fever has gone quite some time ago.
Maybe it went away with Bulgaria's and Romania's
accession. Yes, there is a consensus that this happened too quickly. And we don't want to repeat the mistake, if mistake there was. So what you have is a breakdown of the previous European consensus, which essentially said that enlargement is good for everybody. And you've got, enlargement skeptical countries like Finland, Netherlands, but also Germany, probably. Pro-enlargement countries like Poland or Britain, which are pro-enlargement because of their own national interest agenda, and the enlargement indifferent majority that really cannot be bothered with local Western Balkans issues when the entire European House is in flames.
And from the Western Balkans perspective, because during the war and the years after that, they were in a way under the spotlight of European international community attention. Do you think that it's possible that they now feel abandoned?
Well, certainly they do. And it's a legitimate feeling. But feelings don't change much in politics. That is, say, if Serbia were to say, well, look, we worked hard, and they did. So where's our reward? And after all, Serbia is obviously a part of the European mainstream, whatever it is, Serbia is part of it, right?
Yeah.
And the answer is, well, tough luck, really.
Bad moment. Bad timing.
Bad timing. Well, also, the Kosovo issue, which is still a hot issue, It is a problem, and a legitimate problem, but it doesn't boil down to Kosovo alone.
Yeah, but if you remember, the European Union was cautious and even denied that Serbia has to recognize Kosovo's independence. But now they're quite directly saying that this is a precondition.
Well, nobody has said officially it's a precondition. And the issue I don't really think is about recognizing Kosovo, but preventing Kosovo from being an issue. After all, not all the EU members have recognized Kosovo. Recognizing Kosovo is not a precondition, but disarming Kosovo, stopping Kosovo from being an issue is. And there is an analogy. One of the reasons why Transylvania didn't blow up was that both Hungary and Romania were extremely aware that if there is any problem whatsoever with Transylvania, the EU at that time, it was still the EC, isn't even going to think who's responsible and what the problem is. Brussels will just say, well, go away and come back once this is no longer an issue. This is what the EU now wants of Serbia in respect to Kosovo.
Yeah. Because they said quite directly with their October progress report that Serbia is okay to start negotiations, but it needs to solve its issues with Kosovo.
Yes.
So you think that this doesn't necessarily mean recognizing Kosovo's independence?
No, there is no legal basis for the EU to demand that a candidate country diplomatically recognize some other country. However, the EU says we've got enough problems the way it is. If bringing Serbia in means bringing in an unresolved Kosovo problem, then we don't want it. However, this doesn't mean that Belgrade needs to recognize Pristina. What it does mean is that Belgrade cannot be seen as part of the problem regarding Kosovo. And right now it still is, even if Tadic finally made the declaration calling on the Serbs to abandon the roadblocks. This came in very late.
Yeah.
And, the Serb state is still involved.
When saying that this came very late, could we consider this as a last-ditch effort to gain approval at the Council? And can we say that actually they're doing this because of that, and then once they get the green light, they might again return to this practice?
They're obviously doing it because of that. But they're also doing it because part of the Serb political elites, and indeed part of Serbia's population, recognizes that Kosovo is lost. I mean, Serbia will not be the first country in Europe to have suffered territorial losses, and we speak to the Hungarians, or even to the Poles for that matter, right?
Bulgarians too.
Bulgarians too, absolutely.
Yeah.
The question really is, where does Serbia want to be? If Serbia wants to be part of Europe, then regardless of the rights and wrongs, it cannot enter Europe with that territorial issue still open, full stop. I mean, this simply doesn't happen, right? If Serbia does not want to be part of the EU, that's perfectly understandable. The EU isn't exactly looking like the sexiest joint in town right now. But if not in the EU, then where? I mean, there doesn't seem to be an alternative geopolitical space in Europe.
The Eurasian Union? No, just
does
joking.
anybody have... Well, it's not a funny joke out east, you know. But does anybody want to join the Eurasian Union out of their own?
I don't
With
think
the
so.
possible exception of the population of Mitrovica, where 20,000 people have already made an application for Russian citizenship. As you know, the idea is that, if we have enough Russian citizens, then the Russian army will protect us.
No, it was a joke actually, but if you remember, it was not that long ago when Serbia used to say, well, we have good relations with Russia. Why do we need the European Union?
Yes, this is one of the curses of Serbian history, because Serbia occasionally likes to think it has good relations with Russia. I'm not terribly sure if Russia is that concerned about having good relations with Serbia. It has been largely a one-way street. And of course, it's fun to say, I mean, how many are you? Well, together with the Russians, we're 200 million, right? It doesn't work that way. I mean, look at the Russian citizenship issue. Russia has encouraged, in fact, the Serbs of Kosovo to apply. Lavrov has said that they're examining those applications very closely, which is nonsense. I mean, by Russian law, those applications cannot be considered. By Russian law, you can have Russian citizenship if you have been resident on Russian territory for 5 years, or if you're entitled to Soviet citizenship. Sorry. None of the two conditions apply in Mitrovica. Those applications simply cannot be considered. And this should be the honest response that Moscow should give to the extremely unfortunate people living in Mitrovica. Mm-hmm. But they are toying with their hopes, which I find an extremely indecent thing to do. But this is a good metaphor for the way that Russia looks at relationship with Serbia. While Serbia might genuinely think they are a friend and a partner, this certainly is a one-way street. So I don't really see much wiggle room for Serbia. We'll see what the spring elections bring, but and this will be the ultimate test, regardless of what happens in
This
Brussels.
obviously is a very difficult test, given our own, in Bulgaria, relations with Russia. 20 years on, we are still, as a society, quite divided to Russophiles and Russophobes, which actually is not an actual debate. Because as far as we see the political and geopolitical evolution in the European Union, a lot of former socialist countries actually start looking at Russia quite pragmatically. But to leave Russia aside,
thank God.
Yeah. Do you think that there's a risk, while focusing on the Serbia-Kosovo issue, that the attention might be distracted from other issues Serbia has with, the judicial system, other reforms? Do you think there is a risk of that?
Well, I don't think that there is a risk of Brussels overlooking all the other issues.
That's an important point.
Yeah. Okay, this is the salient issue in public opinion, and indeed in the political sphere right now, because as long as Kosovo remains a hot potato, well, this is simply a no-go. However, assuming that some kind of pragmatic solution can be found, and with some goodwill it can be found that the Kosovars are not making totally unrealistic demands either, then everything else still remains on the table. Judiciary, internal affairs, economy, and Serbia is not in better shape or even as good shape as Romania and Bulgaria were.
Well, this is worth arguing, because if you travel by car through Serbia, you will see the pace with which they build highways, for example, unlike Bulgaria, which never had war and had 22 years of quietness to do a lot of things, while Serbia had war, but still they're trying to build that infrastructure bridge to the EU.
Infrastructure is looking better. I believe that systematic corruption in Serbia is actually worse than in Bulgaria. There's an open discussion. And none of the two would be a great compliment. But I actually think that, unfortunately for everybody, on this point, Serbia is in a worse situation than Bulgaria. And these are issues that will not go away even if a compromise over Kosovo is found. But this is a different debate, because until and unless the Kosovo hurdle is cleared, then discussing corruption or even the highways is simply neither here nor there. But once the Kosovo hurdle is cleared, then yes, all those petty details will be on the table. And the Montenegro precedent, where the idea is now to revise the order of negotiations and have the most difficult dossiers attacked first, well, if it is implemented, and I think it will be implemented and should be implemented, will also be implemented in respect to Serbia. So all those issues are still on.
Okay, to conclude with Serbia, What do you think would be the implications for Serbia itself if the European Council would decide, okay, you're not ready yet?
My fear is that this would mean a massive nationalist victory in the spring elections, and something that I had called at the time Weimar Serbia.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, look, let's face it. There will be no stability, no peace, and no genuine cooperation in the Balkans without the Serbs. Full stop. You cannot pretend they're not there. You cannot ignore also the legitimate grievances they have. It's an issue. But this needs a Serbia that is willing to engage in genuine dialogue and also make compromises and also acknowledge its own evils.
So it could be a kind of a carrot if because
if
after
not,
all, we are talking about negotiations, not
Right.
full membership, right?
Right. But negotiations themselves have preconditions, right? And if Serbia turns inwards, if it reacts with a kind of classical Serb reaction, they don't understand us, and in fact they don't deserve us. Miss Monevski now, right? I mean, they should be glad that we want to be part of the club. That would be bad for Serbia, that would be bad for the Balkans, and I believe it would be bad for Europe. I mean, Serbia is part of Europe. The European project is not only economic and not even only political. It is also a cultural sphere that Serbia is a full member of.
Right.
So a sulking Serbia, an inwards-looking Serbia, and the Serbia that is excluded and therefore left to rot, could become eventually again a destabilizing factor in the Balkans.
That's quite dangerous.
That's very dangerous, both for the Serbs and for the Balkans and for Europe at large.
So this is quite logical that we go to the next country. I think is very important that we discuss, and that's Bosnia and Herzegovina, because although the European Commission report from October said actually no progress at all in any field almost, now Bosnia said it wants to file an application for EU membership.
Mm-hmm.
How do you see these two things combined?
I don't, and I think that in Bosnia a great deal of responsibility is on our side, that is, on the side of the European Union. Dayton was a quick fix. Dayton was about stopping a war, and nobody really thought in the long term what settling Bosnia with such an improbable constitution will entail.
Mm-hmm.
What Dayton did was, in fact, to perpetuate the status quo. That is, carve up Bosnia into ethnic statelets, most of them run by criminal mobs, and to make sure the situation remains permanent. I think it's extremely indicative that while there was no problem at all in integrating the Bosnian army, which today is integrated, professional, they actually had a contingent in Iraq, this army that's made up of two armies that fought a very bitter civil war. Integrating the police forces is a no-no. Because the police forces in each of the entities, in each of the cantons, are the major stabilizing factor for whoever is locally in power. And the local power elites hate each other as they may for political reasons, cooperate very closely on the basis of group self-interest, right? You won't touch my mob and I won't touch your mob.
Do you think that European Union is actually realizing that mistake?
Oh yes. No, we're very conscious of it. Nobody has a bright idea.
But there's no signal for a change of approach.
Well, nobody has a bright idea of how to change the approach. The hope was that such an impulse would come from within Bosnia and be strong enough that then the European Union could support it. Okay, it didn't happen. And not because there were not enough impulses, they were, but the European Union was too distracted and not politically courageous enough to take the risks that it takes and support a movement from within which was aimed at changing the statu quo. By now, the statu quo is quite old, it's very entrenched, and many Bosnians have decided that, well, they have to cooperate with it, even if it's absurd, because obviously nothing better will be ever on the menu. So we have a permanently dysfunctional state, which is stabilized mainly by the fact the international community, which essentially means the EU, accepts its dysfunctionality. This is done at the expense of its citizens and at the expense of chances of long-term stability. I think it's a pretty shameful situation.
So we are now in a crossroads, because with Bosnia filing an application, the EU actually has two options: whether to come up with a new proposal, a new approach, or to accept Bosnia's application and start negotiations which will actually stamp Bosnia forever in this.
Well, okay, there's always an optimistic perspective, and the optimistic perspective, which wasn't totally ludicrous, was that once Bosnia eventually, warts and all, the way it is, will become an EU member, then all this will become irrelevant within a broader European context. This might have been the case with an activist and rich and stable EU. This certainly is not the case today. I mean, the EU will simply not have the resources or indeed the political will or interest to nurse Bosnia back to political health if and when it joins the Union. So in a way, it almost doesn't matter whether Bosnia's application will be accepted or rejected, because Bosnia as it is cannot join the Union. Full stop.
Then why do you think is this decision of Mr. Izetbegovic to file this application?
Well, I think he's sending us the bill. No, and
Yeah.
it's entirely legitimate. He's okay, you guys have been the co-creators of this mess. Own up. We are the Bosnia that you have thought up. So that's the Bosnia you get, right?
Right. It's your problem now, you solve it.
It's also your problem. I mean, it would be extremely foolish for Bosnian leadership to say it's your problem, because ultimately, a country is never anybody's problem before being the problem of its own citizens, right? Whoever is responsible for the mess, the citizens are those who ultimately have to solve it. But the EU cannot pretend it's not co-responsible. And that's essentially what Izetbegovic said when he said, okay, guys, own up.
Okay. So it's difficult to predict what the EU's move would be.
It's difficult to predict. I rather think it will be a rejection for procedural matters, and also because the EU today is a much more brutal place than it was, say, 5 years ago. 5 years ago, we were all politically correct and fluffy and nice.
Diplomacy set aside.
But look, when it comes down to the money, niceties go aside, okay?
Yeah.
So right now, it's cutting to the bone, and I don't think the EU is going for political correctness anymore.
And no patience at all with the current crisis.
No, for obvious reasons.
And Montenegro, it's a very strange case in all this jigsaw puzzle.
Well, in a way, Montenegro is too small to matter one way or the other. And given the fact that it actually has made substantial progress, and given the fact that it's probably the only country where there is no unavoidability trade. I mean, one of the great fears in Brussels when opening yet another chapter, or indeed lighting another green light, is that there will be a dynamism that becomes unstoppable, right? No, Montenegro can be stopped at any stage, precisely because it's small. Therefore, the decision about Montenegro will be not really so much about Montenegro itself as about keeping the European project going. And I think I cheer everybody up in Brussels that somebody still wants to join. So why not give Montenegro the go-ahead? It's not dangerous, okay? And if Brussels changes its mind, then it changes its mind. There will be no big price to pay.
Do you share the vision that with Croatia joining, because, you know, at the background of all these green events, there will be a celebration on the 9th of December with the ceremony on the signing of Croatia's treaty. But do you share that vision that Croatia would be a kind of stimulus for all the countries in the region?
In a normal world, yes. In a way, if it was still a very open game, that is, you play by the rules, you meet the conditions, you're automatically in, then yes, Croatia should have this kind of impulse effect on everybody else. But it's no longer the case, okay? The rules are shifting. Mm-hmm. The EU is in the process of profound transformation. If it emerges victorious from this transformation, this will mean that the sovereignty shift to Brussels for any new members will be much bigger than originally imagined. If we do not solve our crisis, I think we'll become much less attractive. Incidentally, if we don't solve our crisis, if the EU breaks up into what is called two-speed Europe, I think the term is a misnomer. There will be no two-speed Europe. There will be a multi-speed Europe.
Right.
Which will mean that there will be the core Europe around the euro much more integrated economically, which means politically, than it is today. And then there will be the periphery, which
is obviously not that attractive for countries, for the countries in the Western Balkans.
Well,
right?
Yes and no, because the periphery will not be moving at uniform speed, okay? Mm-hmm. Which will mean that, in fact, we will have a reduced core Europe, the Euroland, and then a kind of grey zone in which being formerly a EU member or not will not make such a huge difference as it makes today, okay? Because what will really matter if you're part of the euro or not? And this might reduce the attractiveness of joining the EU.
Indeed.
Because the real issue will be joining the Eurozone. Then Montenegro and Kosovo will say, well, we're there already, right? Well, okay, it's not serious. They have simply adopted the euro as national currency, but that doesn't mean they have any influence over the Eurozone. But this will change the political geography of Europe so profoundly that the Croatian impulse will just get lost amongst the rising cacophony.
Because it seems like a notion to, the the actually good competition between different countries, like it was with Bulgaria and Romania. Look mm-hmm. how the Romanians are going. Mm-hmm. We have to catch up, and they vice versa. Mm-hmm. But countries in the region are so much different, so it's very difficult to make such mm-hmm. competition mm-hmm. fruitful.
Right. Especially as the price is no longer that clear.
Yeah, precisely, because no longer, and they have this kind of sense, what kind of a union are we joining? Mm-hmm. And for the Croatians, it's a little bit, maybe we've managed to catch the last train.
Right.
But what about the others?
Well, it's not even so much a question of trains, but do we really want to go where the trains are going, right?
Yeah, indeed, because for mm-hmm. us it was the last train, but for them is mm-hmm. there's the right train.
Mm-hmm. What it might simply mean is that there will be a cooling off period for everybody, a wait and see period. There is a great deal of integrating structures operating in the Western Balkans already. I mean, if you think of the classical, we'll say, interwar vision of Europe, of totally sovereign nation states, I mean, those totally sovereign nation states don't exist anywhere on the continent, right? Mm-hmm. Even if you're not part of Europe, of the political Europe of the EU, you're still connected with it with the different treaties you've ratified, different procedures you've adopted. So the kind of completely sovereign world is simply no longer there. So what it might mean is that this intermediary phase might last a couple of years longer until the EU sorts out its own mess one way or the other.
Mm-hmm.
The urgency is no longer really there, in the sense that, well, the Western Balkans are in fact already today an EU enclave, right? They
Yeah.
are surrounded
Yeah.
by the EU.
Mm-hmm.
It might turn out the kind of piecemeal arrangements that will be made will provide satisfactory enough for both sides to survive the period of transition. And once the new EU architecture is clear, then it will be much clearer for everybody. Do we want to join, and what is the price of joining, right?
Right. Okay, I really, not that I wanted our conversation to be optimistic, but with these developments in the European Union, it cannot sound optimistic at all.
No, but usually the idea was, well, you guys in the West, in the EU, you've got it made, and you're simply denying us our slice of the pie, right?
Mm-hmm.
This is no longer the conversation. The pie is disappearing as we speak. The EU is not that golden standard of success that it was.
What is actually worrying me is that so far the European integration and the so-called European perspective was the main driver of reforms.
Mm-hmm.
Now these countries need another driver of reforms, and it's still not on the horizon.
Yeah, well, I was always kind of skeptical of selling public opinions the idea, we don't really want to do this, but big bad Brussels is forcing us. So the idea is, freedom of expression is not something we really want to have, but we have to have it to shove it to Brussels, or free trade, or gender equality, or lack of corruption. I mean, Brussels doesn't impose anything that could honestly be objected to from an internal perspective, right?
Mm-hmm.
In fact, Turkey is interesting, because while Turkey has really officially shifted course on Brussels, and now it says, well, we're not really sure if we're interested, but they continue with the internal reform progress, which is...
For their own sake.
Yeah, because, okay, I mean, those things are good. It also happens that Brussels wants them.
Yes, but Turkey has the economic driver. It has the economic power now. Maybe that's one of the reasons why.
But it's also one of the consequences. Turkey wasn't in that brilliant shape, say, a dozen years ago.
No.
One of the reasons why Turkey has become a local economic powerhouse is that it has not only endorsed, but actually implemented so much of the economic and structural reform that Brussels demanded, right?
Right.
So if Turkey were to become a role model, and so, okay, those things actually work. It's not just fancy window dressing that is an unreasonable demand from Brussels. It makes sense. Even if we don't join the Union, it still makes sense. And Turkey apparently is more than happy to play the role of mentor. So maybe Turkey, in the interim, could assume this role.
Right. Well, Turkey is still a topic taboo for this region, actually. We're still not quite evolved to accept the realities.
But we have to. I mean, look, Russia is a taboo was a taboo topic for Poland, say?
Yes, indeed.
Mm-hmm. And because the psychological relationship was similar.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, I would prefer to have Turkey as a taboo topic than Russia. Turkey is behaving in a slightly more rational way than Russia is. But Poland also had to realize that, okay, basically everybody has had a hard childhood, right?
Yeah.
Our sub-story is very real, very true, and nobody's interested. So we cannot change our past, What we can do is own up to our present and hope to influence the future. And we were able to have a reasonably fresh start with Russia. No illusions there. I mean, nobody fell in love with anybody, okay? But we can't have pragmatic dealings with Russia. Russia realized that it cannot really have good relations with the EU while being destructive on Poland. Poland has realized that the EU is not going to adopt the Polish perspective on Russia. Mm-hmm. So both sides had to realize for pragmatic reasons they need to tone down their policies. Okay, there was a symbolic moment of the Smolensk crash, which helped because it was a genuine moral shock for both sides. But we are capable of engaging in a pragmatic policy cooperation with Russia.
Yeah, and then the approach is small steps but constant walking.
Absolutely.
Right.
And don't expect miracles. And don't pretend it's a love story. It's not. If this kind of relationship would be possible with Turkey and would demand a great deal on both sides, of course, I think it would be extremely beneficial for both sides. Turkey is still looking for the regional context. It can become a permanent guiding element.
I think it already found it. Or at least it seems so with the developments in the Middle East.
I think this is going to be very short-lived. I don't really see Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt endorsing Turkey's vision of a secular state. And it's not only the Balkans that have a difficult historical relationship with Turkey, so does the Arab world.
Right. So there are a lot of question marks. What is Turkey headed to?
Yeah, and okay, all this essentially is juggling concepts around. No decision to be made anywhere. But I do think that Turkey's interests would be best served by having a leadership role in the Balkans where the relationship can be stable. Mm-hmm. The Arab world will be sorting itself out for another 10 to 20 years. And Turkey's statist secularism is not a model that will be enforceable in the Arab world.
And it's changing, obviously.
It is changing. The fear is, of course, that in the long run it will be the Arab world will change Turkey and not the other way around. And this really is the fundamental issue, you see. When Sarkozy asked his rhetorical question, do we want the EU to have a common border with Iran, Iraq, and Syria?
Right.
Okay, the answer is, of course we don't. And if we had a choice, we would say we don't want those common borders. We don't have this choice. The only choice we have is whether those common borders will be Turkey's eastern borders or western borders.
Right. And how would they be protected?
Well, exactly.
Also?
Will Turkey be part of the European project, or will Turkey be part of the European problem, right?
But Turkey is, looks like it is ripening for the idea of a Norway scenario for itself. Mm-hmm. Do you think that's a kind of a compromise? In between these extreme visions about Turkey in Turkey and in the European Union?
To replicate the Norway scenario, it helps if you're Norway. Norway does not have a historical past in Europe, okay?
And no cultural differences.
There you go.
We have to admit that.
Right. I mean, well, the Norwegians are weird, but that's a different story. Okay, everybody's weird. I'm sure that if, say, Sweden would have liked to play the Norway scenario, somebody would remind everybody of the Swedish invasions in the 17th century, right?
Yeah.
Europe is a place with a long historical past. Part of the Norway scenario is that Norway is only an extremely rich country which is totally sovereign to do what it wants with its money. Mm-hmm. If you wish, a Qatar, right?
Right. They have their oil, which is very important these days.
That's where the money comes from.
Yeah.
So, Norway's influence or Norway, the intermediary, is not a political threat to anybody.
Mm-hmm.
Turkey simply doesn't have this past. It cannot be, even if it wants to be an impartial negotiator, it will never be seen that way. This is an illusion, this is a fancy. Having said that, Turkey's impact does work both ways. I remember speaking to a Turkish colonel in Bosnia, in Zenica, when the Turkish army entered as part of the UNPROFOR.
Mm-hmm.
He told me that they had been trained for months in advance about how to behave. I mean, this is the Turkish army returning to Europe for the first time since World War I. They had extensive human rights training, whatever. And then we come in, he says, and we realize we have to teach the natives about separation of church and state and this kind of things. So,
wow.
Yeah, well, it must have come as a shock. But yes, but that was the problem. So Turkey does have a role to play, and it also can be a very positive role. But Turkey cannot be under the illusion that people will accept it at face value. It comes with a past.
Yeah.
And this is why Norway's scenarios seem too fanciful by half.
I've always been impressed how talking about this very small region of the Western Balkans, it's inevitable to start talking about Russia, Turkey, even Norway. Mm-hmm. So interesting. Well, thank you so much. It's been
My
very
pleasure.
interesting for me. Thank
Thank you.